This lecture covers coding standards. Coding standards should be defined at an organizational level so that all teams within an organization produce software program files that are consistent, regardless of the department or the team that produced them. Without standards, teams would omit items or write what they think should be included. Coding standards simplify project management, code reuse, configuration management, software transfer, and software maintenance. Coding standards facilitate understanding programs because the programs contain the same items such as file headers, comments, and the format of the program is the same. Additionally, standards ensure that the important items are included. Also, coding standards help test case generation, which can be gathered from the functional descriptions of programs and in-code comments. Coding standards aid in code review, when an application design is converted into source code and compiled into executable programs, the development team must consider several factors: how to translate the design into object-oriented programs, how to organize the classes and the web pages, and how to assign the work to the team members. An important aspect of implementation is defining and complying with code standards. When good coding standards are followed, software productivity and quality increases and cost and time to market decreases. Coding standards are rules that serve as guidelines when writing programs in an organization. Coding standards should define the optional and required items that should be contained in programs. The format and language to be used should be specified and also designated as required or optional. The coding requirements and conventions should be defined, and the methods and responsibilities involved in creating and implementing coding standards should be defined and reviewed continuously for improvement. Coding standards should define the optional and required items that programmers need to include in programs. When projects use the same standards, collaboration, software reuse, and integration are much easier to accomplish. Additionally, documented coding standards give a basis for future improvement of coding standards. Coding standards usually specify inclusion of a file header at the beginning of each program, and in the header, the location of the file, the version number, the program author, the project name, the update history, and other useful information are included. Another coding standard is a description of classes in a program. In the description, the purpose of the class is described, a description of the methods, and a description of the attributes are included. Additionally, the types of in-code comments that should be included while coding the class are described. Coding standards include coding conventions. Conventions for naming packages, paths, files, classes, modules, functions, attributes, and constants ensure that programmers can collaborate in implementing these items. There are formatting conventions, rules for formatting program statements that might include breaks, and indentation, alignment, and spacing to ensure consistency in the look of the source code. There are conventions for in-code commenting that might include when comments must be provided in programs and a format for writing the comments. Some organizations can run amok when defining coding standards. Coding standards should be applied according to the needs of the development organizations. When a development organization is familiar with the application domain, then less coding standards should be applied. If an application is new and more difficult for developers to understand, then more coding standards should be required and more descriptive comments about the application should be required. So the application will dictate which coding standards should be applied. The project stakeholders, including the developers, should determine the coding standards, and they should be barely enough. Coding standards should be barely enough to reap the benefits while keeping the effort to implement them at a minimum. Developers should be involved in defining coding standards so that they will be easy for them to understand and practice. Coding standards should be documented and should include examples in the first version of the coding standard, should be published as an official document, and should include examples of how the required items should look, and additionally, examples of the optional items should be included. A couple of hours of training on how to use the coding standards would be helpful for the developers to understand them and also to give the developers an opportunity to ask questions. Coding standards, once defined, should be practiced, enforced, and checked for compliance regularly. If coding standards are not practiced, then they are useless. Therefore, a compliance check should be done regularly. As time goes by, compliance to coding standards become a part of the organizational culture. It is important to assign responsibilities to individuals involved in practicing coding standards. It is additionally important that the individuals know what they are responsible for concerning coding standards. For instance, the programmer is responsible for the file header, functional descriptions, program format, and the format of comments. Reviewers would be responsible for checking the program for compliance with coding standards. The configuration manager would be responsible for making sure that the files were properly reviewed and that issues were addressed. It is important to establish checking mechanisms to ensure that everyone fulfills their responsibilities. The practice of coding standards should involve all stakeholders. The failure or success of adherence to coding standards depend upon the stakeholders involved, including the developers. Therefore, the stakeholders' opinions should be taken seriously by management. Time should be taken to communicate the rationale and discuss issues and resolve issues with stakeholders concerning coding standards.